Every person, every living creature on our planet sooner or later inevitably encounters death, as a stranger and once his own. No one and never can avoid this. Not only that, practically all living beings live at the expense of the destruction of other living beings, except for plants. And not even all of them. And yes, plants are also living beings, so even herbivores ultimately live at the expense of the death of others. And that's why each of us, sooner or later, but in fact almost everyone and always thinks about it, about death. Does everything end after it? Does it all end here? What's the point of such a life? Consciousness refuses to believe in this, and so we make up different stories about God, the soul, the afterlife, and the like. Or are these not stories? How to find out if the soul exists, and in general what it is, where it is located, how to measure it, how to connect with it, especially if a person is already dead. Is this even possible? Good day, you are on the Epic of Disbelief channel with Mikhail Kalmikov, and today we will try to find answers to all these questions with you. In fact, the topic of the existence of the soul and the afterlife is quite slippery, and you can't approach it with just one video. Each aspect deserves a separate and thorough examination. Otherwise, we inevitably slide into one or another extreme, which in fact usually happens. Someone becomes a militant atheist, and someone else becomes no less militant supporter of any religion, starting from Christianity and ending with pagan witchcraft. But neither the first nor the second nor the third brings a person closer to the knowledge of the truth, but makes him a good pawn in one of the existing systems, a well-controlled pawn. That's why we have to start from a very far away. Perhaps it would be necessary to release a mass of preliminary introductory videos, but fortunately, this video is not the first one. We started approaching this question with you very subtly, about a year and a half ago. The path to this topic began with my video, The Root of Evil. Then half a year later, I released 3 parts of the series, What DNA is Silent About. Many viewers asked if there will be a continuation. Well, here it is. There is also another film that was released just a few days ago. It's called There Will Be No Second Coming. And if you start to get confused as you watch, you will almost certainly find detailed explanations in one of these previous 5 films. So let's try to start. The birth of a soul. Where should I start this story? Perhaps with the world of sensation. You don't have to be a very educated person and read or study something to encounter the belief in the existence of the soul in one form or another. The belief in God and the soul exists everywhere where there is a man. No matter where you are, in the center of European civilization, or in the African jungles, in the center of the Arab world, or in the frozen tundra, in Kamchatka or Alaska, in devastated America, or among the New Zealand Aborigines. This absolutely does not matter. Belief in a higher power, the afterlife, in the existence of the soul in one form or another is everywhere. And even among hardened atheists, among scientists, physicists, mathematicians, who seem to be materialists to the bone. No. And notice that the closer they get to old age, the more they start to believe in God, some higher power, to seek Him. And in general, all science is essentially such a covert, convoluted search for God. But most often, many simply quietly admit, yes, there is, they say, some power, the Creator, and that's all, without names, specifics, or confessions. And yes, there will definitely be among the viewers those who will say, for example, Buddha said that there is no soul, but there is some kind of stream of consciousness. But if there was no concept of the soul even before Buddha, then who would he have said this to? Then this very concept would not have existed. However, it was there even before Buddha. So, to some extent, Buddhism can be seen as one of the first attempts to explain the soul in a more materialistic way, can it? And the very concept of the stream of consciousness is, for the most part, just a play on words. Substitution of concepts, replacing one word that signifies some essence of a person with another, but in fact signifying the same thing. And the concept of God was subsequently replaced by Buddha himself. Ironic, isn't it? Just like, by the way, with Jesus Christ, who never said he was God. On the contrary, he said he was the Son of Man. But who cares about that? But people can't live without a tangible idol. And in the end, they made a god out of him too, just like the golden calf idol. Moses just had to be away for a week on business. Thus, the concept of the soul and higher powers existed and exists, regardless of what religion or confession a person belongs to. One way or another, despite the considerable distance between the first and ancient people from each other by seas and oceans, everyone has knowledge about the soul. Why? From a pragmatic point of view, this is related to the first and probably the only sequence, of course, with objective reasons. Fear, the understanding that your time is about to come, your hour will strike, and you will be no more. And no matter how much a man is a militant atheist and a supporter of evolution, after 60 years, he will no longer be so categorical. And by 70, he will almost certainly start to assert about the Creator. Not everyone, of course, changes their point of view, especially media personalities, or if simply on people, but very many. If you doubt it, verify it yourself. The main mass of militant atheists is precisely the youth, and as they grow older and approach old age, the number of atheists sharply decreases. It's understandable. The youth still have their whole life ahead of them. Why think about something ephemeral, smelling of naphthalene? When we have the whole world in our hands, we can do everything. We will write programs, fly into space, create robots, and such as self-deception. Exactly self-deception. Because, as Professor Volin once said, the trouble of man is not that he is mortal, but that he is suddenly mortal. In addition, the youth do not yet have that rich experience of a collection of strange events, mystical coincidences, which accumulate with old age. But there are textbooks, authoritative scientific articles, and similar dogmas, which are very convenient to refer to, which stand firmly on their feet and create the feeling that everything is stable here. This is important, especially for the youth. And the old people, what old people? They are just delusional eccentrics. That's how it looks, or approximately so, from the side in any case. So, the fear of death, of complete oblivion, of the unknown inevitably makes a person invent something and somehow deceive himself, thus soothing and inevitably giving birth to a belief that he does not end his existence with death. That there is some inner self, consciousness which continues to live, but in some other form. After all, think for yourself. You were born once. Then for many years, decades, you learned and stood on your feet, fell in love, committed crazy acts, fought, worked, gave birth to your children, raised and fed them, worked, made friends, just to stop once and for all. 500, it can't be. Somewhere deep in the soul, there must be some awareness. That which keeps the memory of all these lived years about the experience that has accumulated over the decades. It is still needed by someone. Where does consciousness go after death takes our body? Consciousness. But what is this very consciousness? Where is it located? As if some aborigine in the jungle would discuss this matter. Well, indeed, cut off a hand. But the consciousness will remain. And even having lost all extremities and most internal organs, our consciousness will not disappear anywhere. But if a person loses his head or heart, then the person will inevitably die. And it's unknown whether I will remain after this. And then it would be logical to assume that our soul, our self, should be either in the heart or in the brain, in one of these most important organs. Presumably, almost any person would reason in the same way. And yes, usually the soul is settled, either in the heart or in the head. Well, when a person wants to confess his love to another person and give all of himself to them, they usually offer their heart and thoughts, which are in the head. Well, yes, in a hand. But that's about something else. It's about working for the benefit of the chosen one or the chosen one. With the development of medicine, it became clear that the heart, although it is a critically important organ, but in some cases, it can be turned off too. During surgery, for example, to connect devices for blood circulation, and sometimes even transplant a foreign heart. And the person continues to live in any case for some time. Consciousness remains in place, so the soul is still not in the heart. The brain remains. That seems to be all. Now, it's clear that the soul is in the head, but there are still some inconsistencies. For example, each of us regularly falls asleep for several hours. Some sleep more soundly, some less so. And here's the thing. When a person is asleep, something strange happens, namely dreams. Most of all, this resembles a separation of consciousness from the body. In dreams, we travel to some fairy tale worlds, while the body itself lies motionless in place, and sometimes it's even hard to wake it up. But how so? The head, here it is. The heart also doesn't go anywhere. And the person, his consciousness. During this time, it is in some other world, with completely different people, or even not people, and lives some other life, communicates with other beings. And from about this moment, any person understands that he himself, his consciousness, his I is not at all in the head and not in the heart, but somewhere in a completely different organ. But where is Nalitzo's instability? On the one hand, every person knows that consciousness exists, that the inner self, each person has their own. On the other hand, it's completely unclear what it is and how to touch, see, measure it. Literally, it's something intangible in the literal sense. Perhaps that's why in Russian the word soul is derived from the word breath, meaning something airy, flying, elusive, like air, which, by the way, has the same root. And in English, the meaning of the soul is roughly the same as spirit, although not quite. In fact, spirit is a soul that has left the body, a bodiless spirit. But if it is in the body of a living person, then it is already the word soul. That is, even our languages distinguish between the concept of a soul in a person's body and a soul that has left the body. In one case, it's a soul, and in another, it's a spirit. But most visibly, such a division is demonstrated in Latin. There, too, a free spirit that has left the body is denoted by the word spiritus. But if it has not yet left the body, if it is still in a living person, then it is called anima, which literally means living. By the way, this is where the word animate comes from, which means to bring to life. For example, cartoons are often called animation. That is, the bringing to life of pictures. The presence of such verbal divisions means that a person can live only if this very elusive but moving principle is present in him. Without it, a person is dead, either completely dead or in a coma or asleep at the end of the ends. In general, sooner or later, one way or another, any reasonable person, any civilization comes to the conclusion that there is something weightless, immaterial in a person, without which, however, life itself is impossible. What drives the organism, makes the heart beat, and the brain think. And this means this is something that needs to be found and fixed, described in scientific articles, weighed and measured. 21 gram. In itself, if logically the soul must exist, then it needs to be found. And this, in turn, means that there will always be researchers who will enthusiastically test any hypothesis, trying to somehow touch, measure, see the very soul. Such attempts have been made at all times from ancient Egypt to the present day. And one of the most curious experiments took place in the year 1900, when it became absolutely clear that finding the organ in which the soul is hidden is not possible. An American doctor and biologist, a physician from Massachusetts, Duncan McDougall, decided to fix its existence in a fairly original way. If the soul cannot be seen, then perhaps it can be weighed? Thus began one of the most controversial and mysterious experiments of our time. For this, he built a bed scale in his clinic where he lay dying tuberculosis patients. To be precise, 4 tuberculosis patients, 1 diabetic patient, and 1 with an unclear diagnosis. Such patients were selected specifically because, first of all, it was known for sure that they would die, and they did not have long to live. Secondly, all 6 were extremely emaciated and could not move, which was an important condition for the experiment. As McDougall himself wrote in his article in the American Medicine Journal, Volume 2, for the year 1907, April. In my first study, a man who was terminally ill with tuberculosis participated. This disease, it seemed to me, was best suited for my experiments, because the end of this disease is accompanied by the patient's extreme exhaustion, whose death is not accompanied by any muscular movements that could be reflected in spontaneous movement. Lines of weights. The first patient was under observation for 3 hours and 40 minutes, right up to the moment of death. He lay on a special bed set up on a weighing mechanism, which was balanced and had a scale with a pointer. When the patient was placed on the special bed, everything was done to make him as comfortable as possible, even though he was essentially dying. During the few hours spent on the special bed, he slowly and steadily lost about an ounce of weight per hour due to the evaporation of moisture through breathing and sweat secretion. Throughout the 3 hours and 40 minutes, I kept the weight pointer slightly above the average weight scale reading to more accurately determine the weight loss, if it occurs. After 3 hours and 40 minutes, the patient died. What unexpectedly coincided with the sharp movement of the weight pointer to the lower edge of the scale, which was even accompanied by a noticeable hit of the pointer on the lower edge of the weight scale, where the pointer stopped. The weight loss was established and equaled 3/4 of an ounce. This sudden weight loss could not have occurred due to the evaporation of moisture due to breathing or sweating, because these processes occurred gradually, with speed, 1/6 of an ounce per minute, whereas the weight loss at the moment of death was sudden and large, 3/25 of an ounce in a few seconds. The movement of the patient's internal organs also could not have affected the weight, as the entire body was on the scales. The bladder released 1 or 2 grams of urine, but it remained on the bed. And possibly, this only affected the slow loss of weight due to its own evaporation, but this could in no way explain the sudden drop in weight. There was still one possibility to check for rapid weight loss due to rapid exhalation of air from the lungs. I myself lay on the special bed, and my colleagues set the scales in balance position. We determined that the most intense inhalation or exhalation of air by my lungs had no effect on the scale pointer. Then my colleague got on the special bed, and I watched the scales, and his breathing exercises also had no effect. So, in the case of the first patient, we of course have an unexplained weight loss of 3/4 of an ounce. Is this really the weight of the soul? If so, what does this prove? My second patient was a man who also died of tuberculosis, Before he died, he lay in bed for about 4 hours and 15 minutes under observation. For the first 4 hours, he was losing weight at a rate of 3/4 of an ounce per hour. He had a much slower breathing rate than in the first case, which explained the difference in weight loss due to sweat evaporation and respiratory moisture. In the last 15 minutes, he stopped breathing, but the muscles of his face were still twitching convulsively, and then, coinciding with the last movement of the facial muscles, the needle of the scales fell. The lost weight was 1/2 ounce. Then my colleague listened to the heart and found that it had stopped. I tried again, and the loss was a whole 5/10 of an ounce and 50 grains. For the 18 minutes that passed from the moment he stopped breathing to the moment we were sure of death, there was a weight loss of 1 whole and 5/10 ounces and 50 grains compared to a loss of 3 whole 25/100 ounces. Over a period of 4 hours, during which the usual channels were operating, there was no defecation loss. The urinary bladder moved, but the urine remained on the bed and could not evaporate through the thick bedclothes enough to affect the result. After 18 minutes of doubt, the weight scale was again set to its original position, almost at the very top of the scale. The observation continued for another 40 minutes, but no further weight loss occurred. This patient had a completely different temperament than the first one. His death was very gradual, so we had great doubts based on the usual data as to exactly when he died. In my third case, when a man died from tuberculosis, the weight loss was 1/2 ounce, which coincided with death, and an additional weight loss of 1 ounce a few minutes later. In the fourth case, a woman died from diabetic coma. Unfortunately, our scales were not accurately regulated, and there was a lot of interference from people who opposed our work. And although at the moment of death the arrow had dropped so that it took from 3.5 to 1/2 a moon to return it to the state preceding death. However, I consider this test to be useless. My fifth case, a man dying of tuberculosis, showed a marked drop of about 3/8 of an ounce, which could not be explained. This happened simultaneously with death, but strangely enough, after the arrows were again leveled with the weights and then removed, the arrow did not drop back, but stayed there for a full 15 minutes. It was impossible to explain the fall of 3 whole 8/10 of an ounce. So sudden and noticeable was it. The weight arrow hit the lower plank with the same noise as in the first case. Our scales in this case were very finely balanced. My sixth and last case was not a fair test. The patient died almost 5 minutes after he was put to bed and died while I was adjusting the straps. In my message to Dr. Hodgson, I note that I said there was no weight loss. It should be added that there was no weight loss that we would have had the right to fix. My records made during the experiment show a loss of 1.5 ounces. But in addition, it should be said that the experiment was so hasty that the weight loss did not stop completely. And the apparent weight loss of 1.5 ounces possibly occurred due to the accidental displacement of the sliding load on the scales. This could not have been the case with other tests. None of them were done in a hurry. Therefore, I consider my sixth case to be useless. The same experiments were conducted on 15 dogs, observing all precautions for accuracy, and the results were uniformly negative. Without weight loss after death, their weight loss occurred approximately 20 to 30 minutes after death, which is due to the evaporation of the usual amount of urine and is doubled by the evaporation of the same amount of water on the scales. That's really all there is to it. And it seems like there's evidence at hand, at the very least, that dogs don't have souls. However, the same Duncan McDougall in the same article goes on to write that he would not trust the dog experiments, as all the tests were nullified due to the use of 2 drugs administered to the dogs to calm their attempts to break free. He writes that the scales were so sensitive that the slightest struggle with the dog simply nullified all the tests. As can be seen from the article, Duncan McDougall, despite very small statistical data, that is only 6 experiments on humans and 15 on dogs, tries to be as objective and unbiased as possible. He himself admits that 2 out of 6 experiments did not take place, and he completely ignores the 15 tests on dogs. In addition, successful experiments were conducted only on immobile patients, completely exhausted by tuberculosis, which could serve as a basis for the assumption that this is a side effect of tuberculosis itself. In itself, this experiment was rejected by the scientific community as unscientific. For example, Dr. Agates P. Clark stated that at the moment of death, the lungs stop cooling the blood, which causes a sharp increase in body temperature and, as a result, increased perspiration. Karl Krushelnitsky stated that in fact only 1 of the 6 patients confirmed the hypothesis and the remaining facts were rigged. And he accused McDougall of fraud. Interesting, where did Krushelnitsky learn about this? And most importantly, as physicist Robert Parks simply stated, McDougall's experiments have no scientific value. Well, he just said it, and that's it. Psychologist Bruce Hood said that since the weight loss was not reliable or repeatable in similar experiments, the results are unscientific. Professor Richard Whiteman said, this experiment almost certainly does not reflect reality. That is, like in that joke, I didn't read it, but I condemn it, in the addition. An article claimed the experiment was flawed due to a small sample size and inaccurate weights. And overall, he sent and killed 15 dogs. He should be prosecuted. This seems less like criticism and more like persecution. But, excuse me, isn't the scientific world built on the repeatability of experiments, not on empty chatter and guesses? If that's the case, the only reliable way to find out whether McDougall was right or not is to repeat the experiment. But this experiment was never repeated by anyone, even until McDougall's death. Until December of the year 2000, when a certain physicist named Lewis Hollander Jr. decided to repeat it. He slaughtered 1 ram, 7 sheep, 3 lambs, and 1 goat. And as a result, he got a weight change, albeit not in the negative, but in the positive, sometimes almost up to 1 kilogram. However, there was still a weight change, but he was also criticized. In 2005, another doctor, Gerard Naum, proposed a similar experiment and sent his idea to Yale University, as well as to Stanford and Duke University. He was also rejected by the Catholic Church and everywhere else. Well, even though I'm not a supporter of the theory that the soul has some kind of weight, 21 grams is still the weight of a pretty chubby Maybug. But in my opinion, there was no sober criticism of McDougall's experiment at all. He was simply driven by curiosity. Even Duncan himself wrote at the end of his article that, in my opinion, this spiritual substance cannot be ether as such. But if the theory, according to which ether is the primary form of all substance, is correct, then the spiritual substance must necessarily be a differentiated form of it. He himself died quite healthy, still full of strength, at the age of 54, just 30 years after the publication of the experiment. And then some sort of veto was imposed on the experiment, as if someone was terribly afraid of the results. In this photograph, he had only 9 years left to live. One way or another, the existence of the soul is so deeply ingrained in us that sometimes, even being complete atheists and materialists, we come across insurmountable barriers associated with the soul. Let's start from afar. Look, until the 16th century, blacks and Indians were considered cattle. Literally anything could be done with them, and all for one reason only. The Catholic Church believed that they had no soul, and therefore they were not people, but human-like beasts. And only on the 2nd of June, 1537, Did the Roman Pope acknowledge in his bull that the Indians of the South and West and other peoples, whom they considered mute cattle, are also people and should be converted to the faith of Christ? Negroes and Indians were baptized, and although this did not save them from further slavery, but still killing for no reason, just for fun, became much less. From the side, it may seem that there is nothing unusual. Well, some kind of incomprehensible philosophical disputes in the church. But in fact, this is a very important moment, and all the further history clearly demonstrates it. Before starting any war, for any purposes, people who are about to be attacked are first dehumanized. That is, it is declared that they have no soul. Well, or, at the very least, it is primitive and on par with animals. This was the case during the Napoleonic Wars, when chauvinism was born and flourished. This was the case during the First and Second World Wars, when fascism blossomed, and so it continues today. If you doubt it, look, for example, at the conflict in Ukraine, at the reports of brave soldiers from both sides. Those who were recently one people call each other whatever they want, just not humans, orcs, pigs, devils. They insult as they please, but they just don't call them humans. The same attitude towards each other is in the Arab-Palestinian conflict. Because if the soul understands that there is not a human in front of you, but a creature without a soul, then any atrocities are allowed. But what to do if it is impossible to prove the absence of a soul? Then faith in the afterlife is applied. Their soul will go to hell or simply disappear, and we will go to heaven or reincarnate. At this moment, many will remember the famous speech of Vladimir Putin and think that this is a unique event and will be fundamentally wrong. He is the leader of the country. He is obliged to lead us, his people, which in fact he does successfully. But the same thing is done with the same or another level of success and all the others. And the most glaring example is not, you did not guess. It's not Nietzsche, not semi-mythical Nicolas Chauvin, the progenitor of French chauvinism, and not even radical Islam, but Krishna's Hinduism. Look, there is such a sacred book in Hinduism. It's called Bhagavad Gita. Originally, it was part of the Mahabharata, but later it was taken out into a separate book and became a kind of Bible of Hinduism. It tells about Krishna's revelation to Arjuna. These revelations were translated into English by Charles Wilkins in the 18th century, and then into other languages, including Russian. These revelations are studied by all who are not lazy. They seek and find wisdom in them. These revelations are finding more and more followers, adherents, and successors all over the world. The main idea that comes to us is renunciation, liberation from attachment to worldly values and even life itself, and even some self-sacrifice for the sake of other people. What could be bad here? And what does the soul have to do with it? I'll explain now. Tractors and followers rarely pay attention to the details and circumstances of Krishna's appearance before Arjuna. Why did Krishna appear at all and start revealing himself? But why? The thing is, at that moment, a great battle was supposed to take place. In the civil war in the Kurukshetra Valley, huge armies were lined up on both sides, and the battle was about to begin. Arjuna got on the chariot and went between the two lined-up armies. And then Partha saw in both armies fathers, grandfathers, teachers, maternal uncles, brothers, sons, grandsons, friends, and also fathers-in-law and well-wishers. These were essentially his own people. And now they were ready to go into battle and start killing each other. Arjuna couldn't bear it and was ready to give up. The bow fell from his trembling hands right in front of the troops. He didn't want to fight and was ready to accept defeat without fear, just to avoid killing his relatives and friends. Oh, Krishna, seeing my relatives gathered for battle, I feel my limbs trembling. My heart is overwhelmed, my body trembles, my hair stands on end. My bow Gandiva slips from my hand, and my skin burns. I am unable to stand. My mind is reeling. I see adverse omens. O Kashava, I do not foresee any good in slaying my kinsmen in battle. I do not desire, O Krishna, victory or kingdom or pleasures. O Govinda, why do we need the kingdom of pleasures and even life if those for whom we seek the kingdom of pleasures and happiness have lined up for battle, risking their lives and wealth? Here are the fathers-in-law, grandfathers, fathers, sons, uncles on the mother's side, brothers-in-law, nephews, cousins, and other relatives. Even though they are eager to kill me, O Madhusudana, I do not wish to kill them, not even for the sake of ruling over the three worlds, let alone for the sake of the earthly kingdom. O Dhanardana, what joy will we find in killing the sons of Dhritarashtra? Sin will fall upon us if we kill these aggressors. It is not right for us to kill the sons of Dhritarashtra and our friends. How can we, O Madhava, be happy killing our own kin? And at this very moment, Krishna appears. He told Arjuna that the soul is immortal, that no one can kill the soul. After death, it is reborn in a new body because it is immortal. And our life is just the clothing of the soul, which can be discarded and changed. That one needs to renounce the worldly, discard attachments, and do only what one must, again, without attachment to the fruits of one's actions and not claiming a share in conquest. His Majesty, Krishna's motive becomes much clearer. Indeed, he saw that he was losing, that there would be no battle, and something needed to be done. And then he stopped time, appeared to Arjuna, and calmed him down, assuring him that nothing terrible was happening. It's just a game, and he simply won't be able to kill the soul. The key is the soul is immortal. You must win or die. But the riches and honors obtained in battle do not belong to you, and you should not covet them or claim them. You're familiar with pain, aren't you? Thus, the renunciation of the Krishnats, their bliss, based on these revelations, is actually the renunciation of a soldier before a deadly battle. A kind of zombie-like body gathering for the calm acceptance of inevitable death, some kind of anesthesia. Before the greatest battle of times, the words served by the tranquility from God Krishna that it is impossible to kill the soul. It probably doesn't matter if it's true or not. It likely is true. What's important is that every person has an internal psychological barrier, an insurmountable obstacle, a prohibition on killing beings that have a soul, not by money, not by force, not by reason, but precisely by the soul. Well, as they say, there are no atheists in foxholes under fire. Psychics and mystics, one way or another, but one thing is clear. Consciousness and soul are still different concepts. Consciousness can be extinguished, slowed down, accelerated, changed beyond recognition, and returned to its original state. Each of us has seen this repeatedly throughout our lives. Well, for example, after taking alcohol or other psychotropic substances, consciousness begins to work inadequately. Such devils occur, the existence of which a person could not even suspect, both good and bad. At the same time, control over one's own body, speech, up to complete disconnection, including disconnection of consciousness, deteriorates. But at the same time, some kind of revelations can occur. Everything becomes clear, but you can no longer tell the world about it. Your tongue falters, legs give way, and body disobeys. And not always does the loss of conscious thought and memory mean the shutdown of the body itself. Sometimes it happens that the body moves as if by itself, performing some actions that seem reasonable. Sometimes it's even unclear from the outside that the person has already switched off. Some kind of autopilot mode is activated in which a person is capable, for example, of getting home if he is somewhere far away. Most likely, it is this that gives rise to the idea of dividing consciousness and soul into two separate, almost independent parts. And this opinion is similar both in religion and in science. Same is true in medicine. The soul is called an unconscious concept That is, it does exist, and it also has some kind of consciousness. This is obviously not only on the example of the state of intoxication. For example, patients who have suffered a stroke often become more inhibited in one sphere or another, depending on the area of the brain that the stroke affected. Sometimes they can't even utter 2 or 3 words coherently. Sometimes they even forget words, even lose the gift of speech. From the outside, it may seem that the person has become stupid, but this is not the case. Inside in his consciousness, he continues to think quite coherently and logically, but he is not able to express his thoughts outwardly. Control over the body, in this case, the speech apparatus, is partially lost. I personally also observed a complete loss of consciousness in a patient during a seizure, similar to an epileptic one, but not being such. By the way, a correct diagnosis could not be made for this patient in any clinic, even until death. And at that moment, when his consciousness was leaving during another seizure, something else took its place. It was fully aware of itself and its surroundings, even had the gift of clairvoyance, which I was convinced of more than once, and it said strange things. Gradually, it learned to control the body of the host and did not hide it. At first, it only learned to speak, then to control the movements of the hands and feet. Such an episode could last from a few minutes to several hours. All this time, except for the very beginning of the seizure, accompanied by shaking all over the body and foam from the mouth, the person continued to live his life. And when he came to, he remembered absolutely nothing of what had happened to him during that time. And it all started after a brain injury in a fight. Various magicians and mystics of all kinds call such a phenomenon possession by a demon, but in my opinion, it was not possession, but rather a soul that tried to take control of the body at the moment of loss of consciousness. What's all this about, I say? To the fact that our consciousness is just a part of the organism's function. She is responsible for one single task: to find a partner, conceive, and give birth to offspring, provide him with resources until adulthood, that is essentially for life and behavior. It is for this function that the organism allocates those very 5% of the brain. All the rest goes to support the working capacity of the organism itself. That is, our consciousness, our self, is essentially just an intellectual interface, a subprogram honed to perform a given task. And it can be programmed, reprogrammed, made smarter or dumber. But not every one of us is such a person. Any living creature, including a human, is a certain organized structure, consisting of 2 or more organisms of male and female. At the very least, one person consists of 1,000 million organisms, united with each other into a single personality. More about this with explanation and justification in my video, The Root of Evil. In itself, the connection between people is intangible, but that does not mean it does not exist or is not dense. If earlier this seemed something unusual, mystical, out of the ordinary, then now with the development of technology, we understand more and more not only the possibility itself, but also the mechanism. How it works, you don't have to go far for examples. Each of us has devices that work through invisible to the eye, imperceptible to the body signals of radio communication, mobile phones, flying drones, intelligent vacuum cleaners. We ourselves have long connected these devices to each other through an invisible, but nonetheless quite real connection. Information is transmitted in huge amounts, right now, past you and through you. You don't feel it, but it's there. Devices can even work independently in connection with each other. An example of this is a swarm of drones or rockets that determine their own target in flight, each on their own. Someone performs the role of a decoy mission, someone attacks the main target, someone's secondary someone is a means of defending the target. And all this happens already in flight without any interference from the operator. However, if you take this analogy further, You can jam or drown out the radio signal with some kind of white noise. Then the control becomes complicated up to the loss of orientation, or it becomes difficult and becomes inadequate. The behavior appears to reflect mental health issues. Indeed, in many cases, we even fix visible damage to the controlling interface, that is, the brain. But in some cases, it happens that the brain seems to be healthy, but the person is still inadequate. This could be caused by a software malfunction or induced white noise. By the way, about blocking impulses, I have also been a repeated witness in my life to how electronic equipment suddenly starts to fail around mentally ill people. And in medicine, there are known cases where one person's disturbance could spread to those around them, even though there seems to be no virus. Virtual world. And if we've already started talking about analogies with a computer, let's continue it further. Look, suppose you're playing an online computer game. Your character lives in the game world and interacts with other characters. This character, if he had consciousness, would be sure that he is him and makes all the decisions himself. However, he will be limited in many ways, firstly by the given parameters of characteristics, secondly by the possibilities of the interface, and thirdly, if during the game someone starts to pull you by the spine and distract you in all sorts of ways, then such inappropriate behavior will be passed on to your character. He will start to miss, go where it is not necessary, he may even freeze. However, he will likely continue self-reflection and may conclude that he is ill. Well, or other characters decide so. The presence of a common egregore of the organism is well noticeable on the example of insects. Try to conduct an experiment at home. Let's say you have a lot of flies or mosquitoes at home. They sit where you don't want them to and generally get on your nerves. Try to kill the flies. Only when they sit on the table, and after a while you will notice that they will stop landing on it. They will sit on the bed wall, floor, television, wherever they want, just not on the table. Periodically, they will send you a suicide bomber scout who will check your combat readiness. After this, try to change the place of attack, start killing flies on the floor or wall, and they will fly away from there too. Over time, they will start to distinguish just a fly swatter raised for a hit. You won't even need to kill them. It will be enough just to raise the fly swatter up. Yes, they will eventually forget this experience, and you'll need to repeat everything again. However, the fact remains a fact. Flies or mosquitoes, bees, lions, ants, and so on act as a team like a single organism. They have a collective memory and a collective mind, choosing individuals for this or that action. This mind actually thinks, seeks strategy, sometimes even a complex one, with a diversion of the enemy from the main goal. So what flies? They are such flies. What does the soul have to do with it at all? We are talking about higher beings, people, not about some flies. Don't you say? Continuing the analogy with computer games, there is a huge demand for game strategic simulations for children, modeling, for example, a beehive, ants, and so on. Even just any tactical strategy, well, for example, in essence, models an anthill or a swarm of flies, where one operator controls the entire swarm at once. And at the same time, he is extremely limited by the game interface. That is, despite the fact that an intellectual being is in control, his subordinates will never be able to build a spaceship, or even just talk to each other with sounds. Simply because the interface does not allow it, it's not provided, there's no such function. Nevertheless, such games develop a person's intellect, reaction, understanding of the overall picture of events, develop the ability to plan, and generally think with perspective in mind. Of course, this comparison is quite crude, since, of course, there is no operator behind some mysterious interface in some forbidden computer club for souls. Most likely not. But still, it gives an understanding of how the soul can connect with the organism, if it, of course, exists. Power. As we see, there is a strange paradox on the one hand. There is no soul at all. There is only our consciousness, which is in the depths of the superneural network called the brain, and which will definitely disappear after the death of the organism, with a probability slightly more than complete. And this means that the soul can be boldly sold because it does not exist, and such a sale looks like a stunningly profitable contract. This means that everything is allowed. You can mock others, kill, steal, abuse, especially the infidels or those who you don't like. In the end, neither the soul nor God exists. Many politicians think so. Many scumbags are just criminals. But that's just one side of the coin. On the other hand, it's a strange concept. The soul constantly interferes. It doesn't allow for mass murders and wars. That's why it's necessary to dehumanize the enemy before starting a war, and proves to his own that he is a soulless creature and a monster. This takes a lot of time and resources. The understanding of the soul influences the adoption of laws, and to adopt inhuman acts and laws, more effort has to be applied. Huge masses of people in any, even the most enlightened state, believe in the existence of the soul and the afterlife. They have to be held back with the help of religious hierarchies, creating churches, mosques, stupas, synagogues. Yes, of course, they bring their own profit, and it seems that religious confessions are beneficial to the state. All this is true, but still, with all other things being equal, they take away a significant part of power over the electorate, and therefore cause inconvenience. Moreover, sometimes even to serious bloody conflicts between the government and the church. There was at least one attempt to create a state in which there is no religion at all, or its power is minimized. This, of course, is the Soviet Union. However, look more closely. Even in the Soviet Union, the authorities allowed rituals to be observed and folk omens were preserved, including religious and rational ones like black cats, or just sit on the road. Rituals are a superficial manifestation of faith in the supernatural world. They all ultimately rely on faith in the afterlife and, in itself, the soul. In general, the desire for rituals is so strong in a person that no state can exist without some form of God. If a ruler wanted to become the sole ruler of his state, he was inevitably forced to become the embodiment of God at the same time. Like, for example, the Egyptian pharaohs, Roman emperors, including Gaius and Julius Caesar. Yes, even in democratic states like the Soviet Union, its leaders were idolized: Stalin, Lenin, for some Hitler or Karl Marx. During the French Revolution, Napoleon was endowed with such divine power, and before him, theorists of democracy. But as soon as the divine aura faded, the state itself almost immediately collapsed. So, souls seem to be non-existent, but there are at least all possibilities for their existence, plus an undeniable innate belief in them in almost every person. And since all conditions for their existence are there, both logical and physical, then why shouldn't they exist? Perhaps we're searching in the wrong spot. Death? Any living organism on our planet, and possibly throughout the universe, inevitably dies sooner or later. It's impossible to prevent this. Why does this happen? Are cells not capable of reproducing indefinitely? Is it impossible to regenerate a broken arm or a severed tail? It's possible, and some living organisms beautifully demonstrate the presence of such a function. This is not something out of the realm of fantasy. Nature has long thought of and developed this mechanism, but for some reason it only exists in a small number of living beings. And even if a creature has such a mechanism, it will still die sooner or later. As they say, one doesn't interfere with the other. With the development of technology, we even found a special genetic mechanism, so-called telomeres, which literally count down the hours of our life, like a burnt Bigford fuse, And when it runs out, the organism dies. Official science believes that this is how the mechanism of evolution works. The organism accumulates some experience during its life, it somehow remembers, is recorded in the genes, and is passed on to the next generation, in which this record causes a small mutation. If the mutation proves beneficial, it becomes established. If not, the organism is discarded. And so on to infinity. The accumulated mass of mutations leads to the emergence of a new species, and then an even newer one, and so on. And so, once again, to infinity. Such a version seems quite orderly at first glance, but that's just at first glance. And now let's move on to the most unpleasant part of our conversation, namely death. It can be very different, sudden and protracted, caused by disease or external influence, incompatible with life. In any case, it's a very sad event. However, we are now interested in the so-called natural death. The point is that the signs of impending death are quite visible to the naked eye, even if a person or any other living being looks healthy. The body begins to prepare for death in advance, sometimes long before death itself. The first preparation is the climax, that is, the fading of sexual functions. It begins at different ages, for some in their 40s, for others in their 50s. It comes to both women and men. From the moment of cessation of sexual function, the long preparation of the organism for death begins. In elderly people, dementia sometimes develops, or Alzheimer's disease, which is essentially the same dementia, but in its extreme manifestation. By the way, the causes of this disease are still completely unknown. The only thing that is known for sure is that it begins around the age of 65 and is characterized by initial short-term memory lapses, and in some cases, long-term memory, as well as a gradual but irreversible decline in brain activity. A few weeks or days before death, a person begins to eat less, loses appetite, thoughts of death come. He begins to recall the past more often, tries to finish what he started, make a will, tell something about his life. Sometimes in his sleep, relatives come to him and call him to them. Unfounded fears appear. A few days before death, a person may completely stop eating, and in the end, at some point, the heart stops beating. However, moments before this, his consciousness completely turns off, as if the brain is trying to shield the consciousness from pain and shock. After this, there is often one or several death rattles, and the person dies. However, this is what is visible from the outside. Inside the brain at this moment, something else is happening, a dopamine explosion. Here's what George Mashore, one of the authors of the study on the processes of cardiac arrest, an anesthesiologist from the medical school at the University of Michigan, writes, "When the heart stops, a real fireworks happens in the brain. Nerve cells release a colossal amount of noradrenaline, which affects the brain lobes and sharpens attention. There is also a release of serotonin, hence hallucinations and mystical revelations are possible. And at the very last moment, dopamine comes from the midbrain. It is responsible for the feeling of satisfaction, gives a sense of warmth and joy, possibly even happiness. That's how it is." It seems to explain all the described cases of clinical death. The feeling of happiness, a long corridor. There is no soul, and those who return after clinical death simply describe their feelings from a drug attack that the brain inflicted on itself. Okay, no. Now let's just try to comprehend everything we heard a little earlier. So, around the age of 50, the body begins to prepare for death. I'll repeat it again. This is important. The body is preparing for death. A complex technology and procedures have been developed over a long time to prepare the body, starting with DNA, in which the telomeres count the body's age, and ending with the process of shutting down sexual functions, decreased attention, memory, appetite. And finally, one more important moment, the shutting down of consciousness a moment before death. Moreover, the body doesn't just shut down the power, but performs a whole procedure, relieving consciousness from pain and giving it relaxation, euphoria, and a sense of happiness. So I have two questions from here. First question, why bother so much about a dying organism, especially at the last moment before the end? Why does nature need consciousness to be devoid of pain at the moment of departure? Why give consciousness happiness if the organism will no longer live? If consciousness will simply disappear? Why such efforts? And the second question, if evolution, as we are assured, works on the principle of accumulation of mutations in the DNA structure. If the experience of generations is passed on by inheritance, then how has nature developed a mechanism to prepare the organism for death? After all, it begins its preparation precisely with the process of shutting down sexual functions. From this moment on, no hereditary parameters, no mutations, no evolutionary progress can be passed on to the next generation, simply because the sexual function is turned off. It's simply no longer there. There's nothing to pass on, especially that part of the process that takes place invisibly inside the brain and can never even be seen afterwards. So until our scientists clearly explain how in living organisms, the mechanism of preparing the organism for death has developed and fixed at the genetic level with the help of evolutionary tools. Until then, I will consider this direct evidence of the existence of the soul, evidence that life did not arise on its own, but was created by some engineer who was able to think through the smallest nuances and details of subsequent life. And it seems to me it follows from this an indisputable fact that none of us owns a soul. On the contrary, we belong to it, and to some extent we are subordinate to it. Just as hands, feet, and other organs are part of our body and our property, so too our consciousness is part of the soul, its property. And from this follows an interesting nuance. It's impossible to sell the soul. It's impossible to sell what doesn't belong to you. But then what about the numerous legends about selling one's soul to the devil or some other demon? It's all simple. Most likely this is a result of confusion in words and formulations. It's impossible to sell a soul, but it can be betrayed, betray its thoughts, desires, motives. To lose consciousness, sympathy, empathy, all that allows us to live in a collective as a single subordinate organism. And then life becomes much easier, and they really do get rich because nothing really holds them back. From death, violence, deception, theft, murder. After a soul's betrayal, all is possible. A man turns into a beast. He no longer has a homeland, a state, and sometimes even relatives. He is not connected to anyone or anything. And what will happen to him after death? Yes, what difference does it make if he has convinced himself that there is no soul and no God? There's just one nuance that bothers me. If the engineer of our body paid special attention to the smooth transition of consciousness into the state of death, if he maximally removed the possibility of experiencing pain, suffering, does this mean that consciousness also tries to preserve itself? Does the information accumulated by a person, which constitutes his essence, still remain? So does someone need it? So there is some existence after death, at least the transfer of this information to the central main entity, some kind of server. And in such a case, a person, or rather that variant of consciousness, who gave up his own organism, his soul, will he be needed by the whole mega-organism after death? I think not. According to the script, the mechanism of preparation for death exists in all living beings, even in bacteria. On one hand, this means that death is an important and necessary part of any life. But how did this mechanism develop if it was taken beyond the limits of the cycle of inheritance data transmission. Nevertheless, this mechanism has developed in some way, and not only in humans. Natural death occurs in the same way in cats and dogs. There seems to be some sort of general electromagnetic organism for which it is very important that the soul remains calm and even happy after death. Because she has a whole life ahead of her in a new body and not just one. I created the subtitles.